the Labour leader announced this morning in Manchester that wealth creation was the number one priority for the party. Before you take us through the actual policies, you're still there, George. What was the atmosphere like this morning in the room?
I think it was a very confident, hopeful mood, in the sense that Labour hasn't been in power for 14 years. And I think this election campaign has probably gone better than they could have dreamt, in the sense that at times all they've had to do is stand back and watch the Conservatives and Rishi Sunak humiliate themselves. At launches like this, I think there's always also a degree of nervousness around potential protesters and interruptions, which have become a feature. There was one protester, but otherwise it largely went off without incident.
Important question: did they feed you? Were there biscuits?
Yes, no, there were biscuits, there were pastries in
oh my goodness.
The green room for journalists. No, so our stomachs were well aligned. So no complaints on that front either.
But interesting on the protester, Danny Finkelstein, Lord Finkelstein, the Conservative peer, who's obviously big strategist for the party too, actually described both the manifesto launch in general, but also the reaction to the protester as pitch perfect. Because I believe the response from Keir Starmer was something like, we've given up being the party of protest, we're now serious about running the country, or something along those lines.
Yes, so he's quite well rehearsed with that line now, after obviously the glitter interruption at the last conference. But no, you had the whole shadow cabinet were here. Saw Sue Gray in deep conversation with Sadiq Khan. Andy Burnham was obviously here, the launch being in Manchester. So you did have a sense of this is Labour's national team, and they were clearly very keen to project the image of a government in waiting.
Why Manchester, George?
It's a city, I suppose, with strong Labour associations, and it was at the cooperative HQ. So something that's often forgotten is a lot of Labour MPs are officially Labour and cooperative MPs. So it's really a reference, obviously, to the cooperative traditions of the Labour movement and the party's affiliates, the Cooperative Party. So I think it was a nod to that.
Rachel, you were at Silverstone earlier in the week for the launch of the Conservative manifesto. High octane.
Yep.
We had that advert, which was very testosterone heavy. I mean, listening to what George is saying and obviously watching the Labour launch on the television, how would you compare the two?
It was pretty low energy. And the reason I asked about biscuits is because there weren't any for journalists. Although Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary who introduced Sunak, told Andrew Marr on LBC that there were biscuits, just the journalists couldn't find them. The reason I'm mentioning this is not just because
very important.
It's not because I was very hungry, but because if you are going to get 100 journalists all the way up to Silverstone, which was quite difficult to get to. There was the coach from Milton Keynes station, and then going through the security that you'd expect at an event where the Prime Minister is speaking, and you're going to have them there for basically 4.5 hours. You would expect maybe some refreshments, and the lack thereof kind of, I asked why, and someone suggested that they didn't have the money on the campaign to be able to provide new refreshments. It was just not a particularly slickly well organised event, and the setting of Silverstone racetrack in itself was quite an intriguing one, because obviously it's a place that is quite an exciting backdrop. They filmed an episode of The Apprentice there a few years ago that didn't go particularly well. But there was lots of exciting things you could do with that as a backdrop. But it was held in a conference room that looked exactly the same as every other conference room, and trying to work out why had they tried to do something by the track, but then Brad Pitt was filming there that day and they couldn't do something by the track. So
that could have been a draw, couldn't it?
There was a lovely moment when journalists were being briefed on the detail of the manifesto, and then you heard this vroom noise as the racing cars went by, and everyone just immediately got up and rushed to the window to see if it was Brad Pitt outside. So there were moments of excitement, but that was the high octane moment of excitement rather than the manifesto launch itself.
And George, I assume that Keir Starmer didn't rush off from Co-op HQ to go to the nearest theme park to ride roller coasters, a la Davey.
I can't think of anything less likely for him at the moment. He's actually seems to have made something of a habit of avoiding
Fun.
potentially risky photo opportunities. So no, I think Ed Davey has a monopoly on that. Yeah.
Right, let's go through the key pledges, and I want to start with tax because it's what people care about. It's what's making all the newspaper headlines. We've heard time and time again from Labour this campaign that they won't be putting up income tax, VAT or national insurance. Did we get any surprises today on the tax front?
No surprises on the tax front, although I think, and this is the theme of the manifesto, the language on taxing non-doms, taxing private schools, taxing private equity executives and oil and gas companies is very unambiguous. And in a sense, when you read through it, what strikes you is that it's an authentically Labour document, by which I mean the language is so strikingly leftish, you could say, relative to the messaging that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves use when they say give interviews with right-wing newspapers or they're talking to business, when they cast themselves very much as cautious and moderate. This is a document that's been assembled by Labour in cooperation with the trade unions and other key organisations, and it reflects that. But
am I right in thinking that Unite didn't actually sign it off, though? They're the one union that didn't.
Yes, so Unite have made a habit of dissent during the Starmer leadership, so I don't think that's hugely surprising. Unison and the GMB are the two big unions close to him. It will be interesting to see how that relationship develops in government. I think Sharon Graham, General Secretary, has taken sort of openly critical line. So that is one to watch. You're right to flag that. On tax, look, I think as I've written in my piece on the site today, what's striking is what's not in it, in the sense, yes, they've ruled out all the taxes you mentioned. They haven't ruled out increasing capital gains tax. They haven't ruled out new council tax bans. They haven't ruled out changes to inheritance tax. You've got sin taxes, fuel duty. We could go on. So that really does beg the question, which Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are rightly being asked now. What are you really planning?
Yeah.
Are you going to come into government and say, look, surprise, surprise, the books are much worse than we thought, and we're going to have to put up extra taxes?
And the Conservatives are making hay with that, but interesting response from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the independent think tank as well. Its director, Paul Johnson, he's actually said Labour's manifesto offers no indication that there's a plan for where the money is going to come from for the things they're announcing. It's the same message really applying to both of our main parties, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the spending pledges in the manifesto are costed because there actually aren't many of them. So Labour is not promising a huge amount of additional spending. They obviously scaled back the 28 billion green investment pledge they had. That was their flagship spending commitments. That's now just over 4 billion a year. So you've already seen some shift on that side. But it was interesting. In his speech, Keir Starmer emphasised there would be no return to austerity. He said, I've worked in a public service. I worked in the Crown Prosecution Service during the austerity years. I never want to do to public services what happened then. But the only way you can deliver that pledge is to raise money, just to prevent the spending cuts that the current government's penciled in.
A lot of what's in the manifesto we've heard trickle out throughout the campaign. So we've had obviously setting up Great British Energy, the hope to recruit 6,500 new teachers, cutting NHS waiting times. Is there anything in there that we hadn't heard about that's a bit of a surprise?
That's a good question. There are very few surprises, and that's quite deliberate because Labour have looked back at, say, Theresa May's social care plan, the so-called dementia tax, or John McDonnell's pledge of free broadband, and thought launching big policies in the middle of a campaign doesn't go well. But what's striking is Labour's never actually had a shortage of policy. It's a sort of myth that they have no policies. They have a lot of policy, which is why it's sort of 25,000 words long rather than just supposedly slim documents. So I think there are interesting strands which perhaps deserve more attention. On the constitutional side, for instance, they're saying they set up a new ethics commission, votes at 16, that's been getting some attention, removal of hereditary peers from the House of Lords, retirement age of 80, there's the new UK-EU Defence Pact.
80?
So retirement age of 80.
Wow.
No, for peers.
Oh, sorry.
Not for all of us.
Not for all of us.
No, that would be a
I'm just having
surprise
sort of a minor heart attack here.
for the House of Lords.
For the House of Lords, sorry. Whew.
The retirement age of 80 will come once they've seen the state of the public finances. Yeah, that's... But no, there are lots of pledges, and I think rather than people saying, we don't know what a Labour government would do, they don't have any policies, the real question is, are they going to be able to deliver all of this in a single term? Does Labour and Whitehall have the capacity to do GB Energy, to do constitutional reforms, planning reform, and so on? That's the real question.
Briefly, particularly this very ambitious target for the NHS and cutting waiting times with extra appointments. The very quick analysis that's been done on that already by health experts is really laying out how difficult that is going to be. I mean, we are nowhere near reaching the 18-week target that Labour's hoping to eliminate by the end of the first Parliament, are we?
No, and on the NHS, they've got some spending commitments, but they are minimal relative to the size of the challenge. But their big bet, and Wes Streeting's been very clear about this, is that you can make the NHS more efficient, and that you can increase capacity by drawing on the private sector, for instance. So similarly, that's the message from Rachel Reeves, which is that we can't treat these problems simply with the old method of tax and spend. And that's Labour's big bet on public services, that you can reform them to get better outcomes, and on the economy, that you can significantly improve growth.
And just finally, George, before we let you get back to the biscuits and the pain au chocolat, it's important to acknowledge what isn't in it in terms of what many Labour voters would like to see. And that, I suppose, is there's no commitment there to scrapping the two-child benefit cap. And they have received a fair bit of stick around this. Is that fair?
Well, I think you're right to highlight that, because that policy has increased child poverty by something like 1 million. It's basically done what it was intended to do, but it has awful consequences for the poorest families. When Labour say we can't afford to do it, it's a bit of a cop-out, really, because it wouldn't actually cost a huge amount to scrap it relative to the size of the state.
It's a cop-out too, because everything is a choice, and they have chosen not to do it.
Yeah. So I think a Labour government would come under big pressure to scrap it. The interesting thing is, I think you can easily do it on the fiscal side, but there's the politics of it. And is Labour prepared to have an argument with the Conservatives on this? The Conservatives will say, you are saying unlimited benefits for large families. And they will encourage the view that if you're going to have a large family, you should be able to support it yourself without government support. They will have to be prepared to have a political argument over it. I'm sure they could find the money to get rid of, but it's really, that's the real question. And that's not an argument they were prepared to have in a election, partly, I think, because they believe Labour lost previous elections because it was seen as too committed to high welfare spending, which is a more politically divisive subject than, say, taxing private schools, taxing non-doms and so on.
George, thank you so much. Rachel, a much smaller launch, if you like, but we had Plaid Cymru's manifesto launch today. Run us through some of the main headlines, if you would.
Okay, so unsurprisingly, this is all about giving Wales a voice and more resources. So they believe that Wales should get 4 billion extra funding from the HS2 project in compensation, and a windfall tax on energy companies, more control over policing given to the Senedd, fair funding for Wales and a fairer tax system, including a £20 a week increase in child benefit. What I think is the most interesting message is similar to the message that we've heard from the Greens, from the SNP, occasionally from the Lib Dems, although the Lib Dems are running a very sort of anti-Tory campaign, but that the message is don't give Labour a free pass. And I think in Wales that could prove quite successful for them, in that we know Labour is going to win the election, but you can make your voice heard in Wales by voting for another party, and then Wales will be listened to more, perhaps by an incoming Labour government.
Yeah, and talking with Ben on the podcast earlier this week, the fact that Vaughan Gething lost that confidence motion and yet has stayed on, that is starting to affect polling in Wales, he says. I mean, to a small extent, but
yeah, it's seen as arrogant. Yeah. It's seen as taking Welsh voters for granted, and no voters like being taken for granted. But I think you want to point out what you think is the most important policy announced in this manifesto.
Well, it's got to be a massive vote winner. Buried in there is a call for Wales to be allowed to take part independently in the Eurovision Song Contest. Now, if that doesn't get people out to vote on the 4th of July, I do not know what will.
I think Wales would do very well for two reasons. One, a nation of great singers.
Belters. Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey.
But anyone singing at a Welsh rugby game.
Oh, yeah.
But also the UK just does so appallingly badly because we're very unpopular. And I think Wales as a British underdog contender could do very well.
Well, then we're going to get calls for a Scottish entry.
Yes.
Wow.
And obviously the Republic of Ireland already has one, and if Northern Ireland had one too, it could get quite messy, quite interesting. I don't know.
Well, we could have like the old school Four Nations of Eurovision. Moving swiftly on, but staying in Wales-ish. Extraordinary scoop from Pippa Crerar in the Guardian this morning about Rishi Sunak's closest parliamentary aide, Craig Williams, who was an MP for Wales. He's now a
candidate.
It turns out that in the few days running up to Rishi Sunak's announcement of the general election, he placed a bet that such an announcement would be made. Placed £100 bet, and all hell has broken loose. Really, reports that. Interestingly, I'd love to know how this works actually, but that a red flag was automatically raised by Ladbrokes where he placed the bet. And it came up that this bet was being placed by, I'm quoting here, a politically exposed person. Now, I have no idea how that system works. Please, if you do know, let us know. But what a gaff.
PEPs, politically exposed persons, are a concept that financial institutions have to flag people who transactions. I mean, it's meant sort of for world leaders and officials, but it comes all the way down to elected representatives. I think it's quite cool that Ladbrokes has that flagging system that I didn't know.
No.
I didn't know existed. But yes, he placed a bet on when the date of the election might be 3 days before an election for that date was called, which is just mind-boggling in its stupidity. But the thing that really, really struck me is that the bet he placed was £100, and that almost makes me think, hang on, was this all just, he didn't really know, was it a guess? Because if he really knew, he would have put more than £100 on. Or is he being really clever, trying to go under the radar with like placing a low value bet, so hoping that it wouldn't get flagged, which of course it did.
I mean, he's apologised. He said it was a huge error of judgment. He doesn't want it to be a distraction. But does it raise questions about Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party's judgment? Because they knew about this before, obviously, Pippa Crerar broke the story. He should have been suspended, surely.
I'm amazed that he's a candidate. And it's a sort of similarly brazen poor error of judgment to Scott Benton, the MP for Blackpool South, who lost his seat in a by-election because he had to stand down, because he literally said to representatives of the gambling industry, I could get some ministers to listen to your case. It's sort of really, it's not even subtle. You would hope that kind of thing, they'd at least sort of make an effort to be a little bit subtle. I don't know if Craig Williams really knew when the election was going to be, simply because I've been trying to work out who in Rishi Sunak's inner circle knew about it. And even Jeremy Hunt only found out, I think, 2 days before it was announced. It was really, really sort of a tightly kept secret. I don't think Michael Gove knew about it until just before either. So did this random MP who's a close parliamentary aide but not particularly senior, did he know about it? Was it just...
Does it matter, actually?
Does it matter? No, he shouldn't. He should have known not to place it regardless. And he's probably going to lose his seat anyway, so...
Well, he's got a pretty big majority at the moment, 12,000. But in this election, anything goes. I mean, presumably, if we see this rumbling on, that they'll have to step in and suspend him, or remove him as a candidate, and then they have no one.
They can't remove him as a candidate. So the candidate lists have been set. So
right.
similar to Labour in Rochdale, he is going to be the Conservative candidate. The Conservatives could disown him, they could pull all funding, but he is going to be on the ballot paper on July 4th.
You've written for the website today on last night's
Grudge Match, yes.
Grudge Match. I mean, a much better format. So we had Sky's political editor Beth Rigby interviewing Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer separately, and then each man took 25 minutes or so of questions from the audience separately. Masterclass in political interviewing by Beth. But I mean, what were your takeaway messages or thoughts from this?
So my first takeaway is exactly what you said. It's a much better format, I think, for holding politicians to account. They can't get away with glib one-liners. They can't just insult each other. Beth was pretty relentless with both of them. Quite different styles. She interrupted Keir Starmer a lot and he interrupted her. There's a lot of crosstalk. With Rishi Sunak, she kind of let him talk because he was contradicting himself enough. But really kind of drilling down with Starmer, you campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. Why should we trust you? And Starmer said, I could campaign for him because I was certain Labour weren't going to win, which is a pretty staggering thing to say. He also said, which I thought was interesting, that he personally isn't politically tribal, and he thinks there are good people who vote for parties other than Labour, which is kind of really crystallising Labour's message of trying to reach out to disaffected Conservative voters and say, we don't think you're a bad person just because you voted Conservative last time. You're welcome here, come and join us. So that was interesting. He got a grilling on tax and funding and all the issues that George talked about a minute ago. Where is Labour going to find the money for this? And then they got quizzed by the audience, and I thought the audience questions were also really good in kind of stripping away some of the political bravado that the sort of leaders have. Best question from the audience came from someone who said to Starmer, "You seem a bit like a political robot," and he just visibly glitched. It was like the computer program in his brain had rebooted, and you were like, oh, come on, this is your one chance to look human. But he did, I think, a good job of defending his policies and standing up for them. There was a guy in the audience who was upset about the VAT on private school fees, and I think Starmer did quite a good job of respectfully defending that policy.
Not a good night for Sunak.
Not a good night for Sunak, no. His five pledges from January 2023, Beth Rigby went through them all and pointed out that 4 of them are moving in the wrong direction entirely. And he sort of argued with her about, oh no, well, I know I said that debt would be falling. I know it's higher now than it was when I said it, but it's still falling. So technically I still win. And it was just cringeworthy in how much he seemed to view it as sort of winning a technical argument, like almost with a teacher, like, well, technically I did do my homework, even if I wrote it in invisible ink.
But he wasn't the man. I mean, regardless of the politics, he's known to be a good man, and he just lacked, and he looked defeated, didn't he?
He looked defeated. She asked him at one point, what's the thing that might make people like you again? And he went, I eat lots of Haribo and I love sugar and Twixes. And I sort of, at that moment, I thought somebody should have given you some Haribo just before you came on for a bit more energy. And then again, some very revealing audience questions, the most revealing of which came from a woman who had been a Conservative Party member, not just a voter, had been the chair of her local Tory party, saying that she was undecided now and she was ashamed of the party after Partygate and after Sunak skipping out on D-Day, and I think that was the moment where he just looked punctured, because if people who have formerly been local party activists are now saying they're not sure if they're going to vote for you or not, you don't have any hope at all.
And what you're saying reflected really, I mean, it's one poll and it's a poll of people who watched it. I'm giving Ben's caveats, I'm learning. But really a comprehensive win given by that poll to Starmer. I mean, 64-36, almost 2/3, 1/3. He'll be delighted with that, presumably, but terrible again for the Conservatives.
And I think that the format of that probably has something to do with it. I mean, Sunak was said to have won last week's head-to-head debate, although
very close margin,
very close margin, and also that winning that poll has not had any effect on the general polls. So there's a question of how much these things matter, but I think both of them got a pretty tough ride, and both of them are pretty bruised, but I think Starmer will be pleased with that performance.
And just another shout out to Beth Rigby, really, a bit of a fan club here, but I think what she did so fantastically is she sort of translated political speak into normal language. A couple of times she sort of said, I'm just going to stop you there. When he says we've got no plans to, that means they probably are, or something like that. It was really, really excellent.